That's the message. And he bookends those conditional statements at the beginning and at the end of the 40-year wilderness march to make it absolutely sure, hey guys, if you obey, then you'll get my blessings. If you don't, better watch out. And so the Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. It's not like the Abrahamic covenant. The Mosaic covenant depends on obedience. And right here is where he states it. And so this is a major change in the whole system of administration with the nation of Israel. People today live such busy and hectic lives that they're often in danger of burnout. There's pace of life today that seems to get faster and faster. And Steve, I think it's also true that this is accurate for people inside the church. Have you found that there's people inside the church that just live such busyness coming and going that they're in danger of stress and burnout?
Yeah, what happens, I think, sometimes is that people feel that they need to be at church every time the church doors are open. And we also have the situation where many times it's 20% of the people involved with the activities of the church and the other 80% not. And so some of that, I think, stems from them having an extra burden upon themselves in order to do and make the church function and continue. And that's a part of leading to burnout. And so I think we should sometimes take a step back and make sure that we're not necessarily placing things of our church activities above maybe our family, and maybe have a balance. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't worship God and honor God, but at the same time, if we're doing things out of guilt because we feel, oh, if I'm not up there, then it's not a good reflection on me or on my family, and so therefore I got to make my family go. That's not a healthy relationship either. Right. And so to our guest, the reason we bring this up is because today's Bible study is in Exodus chapter 18, where Moses, our main character in the book of Exodus, is in danger of being overworked. He's in danger of what we would call burnout. And today's lesson in Exodus 18, we're going to see some advice that he gets. We're going to talk about the implications and applications of that advice. So welcome. We are Reasoning Through the Bible. My name's Glenn, and I'm here with Steve. And we do verse-by-verse Bible studies through the Word of God. And if you have your Bibles, open them to Exodus chapter 18, starting in verse 13, where Moses is going to have a conversation with his father-in-law, and the father-in-law recognizes that Moses is under a tremendous workload and gives him some advice, and we'll get to learn what that is. So, Steve, if you could read in Exodus chapter 18, start at verse 13, and go all the way down to 27. It came about the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood about Moses from the morning until the evening. Now, when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as a judge, and all the people stand about you from morning until evening?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I judge between a man and his neighbor and make known the statutes of God and his laws." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "The thing that you are doing is not good. You will surely wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, for the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I will give you counsel, and God be with you. You be the people's representative before God, and you bring the disputes to God. Then teach them the statutes and the law, and make known to them the way in which they are to walk and the work they are to do. Furthermore, you shall select out of the people able men who fear God, men of truth, those who hate dishonest gain, and you shall place these over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens. Let them judge the people at all times, and let it be that every major dispute they will bring to you, but every minor dispute they themselves will judge. so it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all these people also will go to their place in peace." So Moses listened to his father-in-law and did all that he had said. Moses chose able men out of Israel and made them heads over the people, leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. They judged the people at all times. The difficult dispute they would bring to Moses, but every minor dispute they themselves would judge. Then Moses bade his father-in-law farewell, and he went his way into his own land.
So in this, we have this conversation that Moses is having with his father-in-law. And of course, Moses is God's prophet. He is the one that God chose back in the burning bush. And God has been speaking to Moses and speaking through Moses this entire book. And so now, of course, the people are recognizing that Moses has God's wisdom, and they will come to him with questions. So just that fact's not a problem. But back at the beginning of this passage, Steve, what's the basic problem that arises here?
Well, there's too many problems. There's too many disputes that are going on among the people. That's the first thing I see is that people aren't getting along. As we see Jethro give Moses the advice, he says, give other leadership the ability to go with minor disputes. Well, one question I have is, why can't people just get along and go ahead and settle their minor disputes? Why are they always having to go to somebody else in order to make those judgments? But that's neither here nor there. That's the problem. The people aren't getting along for various reasons. And again, we have upwards of 2 million people, so it's kind of understandable. But the bickering and arguing goes on to the point that everything is bubbling up at this point to Moses. And he's having to make a judgment on all of these things, whether it's a minor dispute or a major dispute.
And he's having to go from early in the morning till late at night answering all these questions. There's people lined up with wanting some of Moses' time, and he's getting pulled in a lot of directions. And so the advice, of course, is, as you said, that Jethro gives him is get some people around you that can help, right? And so down in verse 18, Jethro says, I'm afraid that you're going to wear out. I'm afraid that you're going to wear out. And so that's a potential problem here for Moses. So here's a question, Steve. Are there people today that throw themselves into church work? I mean, what Moses was doing here, one, started out what God asked him to do, and he was just obeying. And so is there a danger of people today, we're just doing what God asked us to do, but we get so busy that we're in danger of wearing out, in danger of burnout?
We are, and I would also add to it that us as maybe church members of a church, a local body, sometimes we feel that the only person that can answer our question or the only person that can settle or make a decision is the pastor of the church. And that shouldn't be the case. As what I mentioned before is, we should take it upon ourselves to be able to do some of these negotiations and come up with a solution before it ever gets to it. And I think that's a danger of having our pastors burn out if we're taking every little thing to them and having them make the decision. That, and then if we take a position of leadership in the church, that then could be the same issue, that now that you're a member of that committee or the leader of that committee, people start coming to you because they know that you're the leader of the committee and asking you these questions. Again, I think there's some wise things that need to be done in order to help keep from burnout of having people make decisions and not come with disputes or questions that don't really amount to anything.
I remember early in my life, I was in my 20s, and I was in a small group Bible study with several other couples, husbands and wives, that would come together on a Friday night for a Bible study. One of the couples in that small group, it would meet in people's homes, and one of the couples was one of the associate pastors of the church. And they'd come just like we were all about the same age, and would just kind of have some good fun and some Bible study. And one time she came, but he didn't. And she says, well, somebody at the church got attacked, and he's down at the hospital helping. And so the wife says, this 2 hours in the week is the only time in his entire week. Again, this was an associate pastor of the church. She was saying this 2 hours is the only time in the entire week where he doesn't have somebody pulling on him as the pastor. This is the only time where he gets to just relax and talk with people as an equal. And so she was saying, please don't mess up this 2 hours. Please don't do something that's going to cause him to lose this one little block of the entire week where he can just relax. And so oftentimes our leaders do get pulled, they get stressed. And the last thing we need is the leaders of our churches, our shepherds, to get burnt out. And so that's what Jethro here was worried about in verse 18, you will surely wear out. And so you mentioned earlier, Steve, kind of an 80-20 rule. And I found this to be true in most churches, is that you've got 20% of the people doing 80% of the work and 80% of the people doing nothing. And so there's always 20% of the work that never gets done. And the 20% of the people that feel obligated, just there's more and more things for them to do. And there is a possibility of burnout. I also remember the very first pastor I ever had, very first church I ever joined, he said that he said, I see people come in and I see two kinds of people. Well, one of them come in and they're busy and they get involved in 4, 5, 6 different things and they're here several times a week and they'll do that 2 or 3 years and then they disappear because they're burned out. And I see other people that come in every Sunday and they sit in the same place and they worship and go home and they never get involved in anything for years and years. And so his advice was find one thing and do it very well. Not 2 things, 3 things, 4 things, or 0 things, but pick one thing in the church and do it well. So just your opinion, Steve, I always thought there's some people around churches that need to do a little less, that they are overworked. They need to do a little less, and there's other people in the church that need to get off their duff and plug in and help out. I mean, wouldn't you say?
Well, we need to realize that we're all the body of Christ. And that is the analogy that's used in that some of us are hands, some of us are feet, some of us are ears, some of us are eyes, some of us are nose, etc. Each one of those parts of the body have a function in order to help the whole body function properly. And so when we take that to our local congregation that we're a member of, if you're not doing something to help out with that congregation, then you're kind of like a wart. Rather than helping the body function, you're just kind of an appendage or something else that's on the body that's really just kind of drawing from the body and not really giving back to the body. And so the question needs to be is that if you're not involved in something, are you really truly being a true member of the body of Christ? And so I think it's very good advice. Find at least one thing to do and get involved with it.
I always appreciated the churches, and some churches will do this. When people come to join, they'll hand them a list with different ministries and say, which ones of these would you like to plug into?
Right.
And if you can't find one you like, then talk with us. We'll find something that you can do.
It could be something very simple. I know people that were involved in some of the churches that I was involved with. One particular couple, one of the things that they did is they were there every Sunday and they would be in the nursery just rocking babies. They liked that age group and they were there. And they ended up rocking several generations of that church. But it took something that was seemed very minor, but it filled a place there that helped to be a very big part of it, because the preschool person didn't have to scramble from week to week trying to find different people. They could always count on those particular people. So that one little thing doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be actually a little thing, whatever it might be.
So look at verse 21 here in, again, Exodus 18. This is Moses' father-in-law. And in verse 21, what does he tell him? He says, you shall select out of all the people able men who fear God, men of truth. And so the general idea here is to select wise, honest men, and then for Moses to reach out to them and teach them God's principles, and then set them over different groups of people in the country, in the congregation, and they can handle the minor disputes, but Moses handle the large ones. And so that would distribute the work. It's kind of a logical way of structuring things. This is the beginning of what we would call the rabbinical system within Judaism, within the nation of Israel, because now we have this system of leaders that leads up to a upper level person or persons, and then going down to people that would be in charge of down to individual congregations. And so that system, of course, is sort of a logical human wisdom kind of a system, and it persists to this day. And even in Christianity, this is kind of how it's set up. And so I would say, Steve, that's a good, practical human wisdom. But is it God's way? One of the things that's not here is that we don't have God commanding this. Where did this advice come from? It came from Moses' father-in-law. And so it would seem to me to be good advice, but does God really command Moses to do this?
He doesn't, but at the same time, we don't see God reverse it. We don't see God say, no, that's not what I want you to do. I want you to set it up a different way. So while it didn't for sure didn't come from God, we also don't see him say, no, this isn't what you need to do. You know, you said this was the beginning of the rabbinical system. One of the things that came out of this also was that the interpretation of the law and everything else that was given kind of morphed into these rabbinical system as far as them saying, okay, God gave the law to Moses, and now it's up to us to interpret it however it needed to be interpreted. And out of that grew all these other extra laws that came about. We're going to see here as we go through here, there's 613. By the way, we're not going to go through each one of those.
Thank you.
But there's 613 that God gives specifically. Well, then they expanded that into thousands of it as well. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because when Jesus comes on the scene hundreds of years later, he speaks with authority. And that's one of the rubs that's going on. And we addressed this when we went through the book of Matthew. That's one of the rubs. Here Jesus is, and he's saying, you have heard one thing, but I say it's another. We saw the continual challenges that came from them. Hey, why are your disciples, why are they not washing their hands before they eat? Hey, why are your disciples, why are you walking through and eating on the Sabbath? Hey, why are you healing on the Sabbath? This all comes from this rabbinical system and their idea that it was their responsibility to interpret the law the way that it was, and they actually became more authoritative than God himself, so to speak. And so now Jesus comes on speaking with authority, and it becomes a major rub with the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Sanhedrin system.
Right, exactly. And so what starts out right here in Exodus as good practical advice to help out an overworked person in the person of Moses, who had taken upon himself all these things. Oh, Moses, good practical advice. Bring some people in to help. And so let's set up a structure of people over large groups and people under them. That system started out as a good idea, keep Moses from burning out. But what it ended up doing was creating this system, this hierarchy of a rabbinical system, that by the time we get down over into the New Testament, now we have political parties in there, Pharisees and Sadducees, and as you just well pointed out, they're more interested when Jesus comes along, are you following my political party and our little set of rules that we made? as opposed to, are you really following God? And so they had set themselves up as the final authorities, and they had set themselves up as oh, we get to interpret what God says, and our interpretation really trumps God's word. And so that was the problem in the system. And so at verse 23, Jethro actually gives one little good bit of advice. If you do this thing, and this thing is the setting up these helpers around them, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure. And so the question there is, did Moses go to God and ask wisdom in doing this? And the text doesn't tell us. But that's really the key, is whenever somebody comes to you and gives you good practical human wisdom that sounds sort of reasonable, what should we always do before we implement it?
Bounce it off of God. Go to him and make sure that this is something that is going to be in the best interest.
Right. So that ends chapter 18. And going into chapter 19, most of chapter 19 is the preparation for the giving of the law and the Ten Commandments, which comes in the following chapter, in chapter 20. So in chapter 19, they're arriving at the foot of Mount Sinai, and God is giving them instructions on how they should act. And this is really, Steve, sort of a major change in the tone of the book here, because prior to chapter 19 is really the getting out of Egypt part. And starting in verse 19 is really the preparation for and getting the law part. So this is sort of a major change in the book here. So Steve, if you could take Exodus 19 and read the first 9 verses.
In the 3rd month, after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. When they set out from Rephidim, they came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountain. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to these sons of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. The Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will come to you in a thick cloud, so that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe in you forever. Then Moses told the words of the people to the Lord.
So here with this, we have, again, people of Israel arriving at Mount Sinai. It says the mountain, and it's really Mount Sinai. And this is where all the action is going to happen.
Right.
This is the Mount Sinai, where, as we'll see in the next chapter, Moses gets the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law. There's a lot of things happen here. And so let's go back and kind of walk through this. If we look at verse 1, it says here, in the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of Egypt, on that very day. And so this, again, is a historical account. It gives us the exact day, so it's telling us the place and the day. It's a historical record. And in verse 2, they camp out Mount Sinai. And if you also look down at the end of verse 3, it says there that it mentions both Jacob and Israel, right? House of Jacob and sons of Israel is really the same thing. Because if you remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So it's saying there in verse 3, this is to the house of Jacob and the sons of Israel. And so what I find interesting, Steve, here is at the beginning of 19, God is already reminding them of what he did for them. Remember, I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt.
Yes.
Says that at the beginning of 19. He's going to remind them again at the beginning of 20. Mm-hmm. And as we've pointed out, he mentions this really from now on throughout the rest of the Old Testament. that he's the one that brought them out. So already, they hadn't been out there all that long, right? It says, again,
Right.
look at verse 1, third month
Right.
is what it says there in verse 1. The third month, he's already, remember, I just brought you out. Don't forget, I brought you out. Don't forget.
Well, and it makes sense because we've already seen they have a very short memory.
Yes.
They went and they started complaining because there wasn't any water. And they went a couple of days later and they were complaining because the water was bitter, that they didn't have food and meat. So we've seen that already, that they have a short memory and they keep going to Moses and grumbling to Moses for things rather than looking to God. So it makes sense that God is starting this pattern.
And then down in verse 4, he's reminding them of the great work he did. And he says there in verse 4, you have seen what I did in that I brought you out on eagle's wings. The term there, I bore you on eagle's wings, gives this literary picture of, I mean, you think of an eagle flying, it looks sort of majestic, and they fly swiftly, and an eagle's powerful. And so what he's saying is, I brought you out powerfully, I brought you out quickly. This was a swift, sure thing, just like on eagle's wings. So he's reminding them that how he acts. When God does something, he does it well. Now, it may be a little while. Remember, it was, 430 years?
Right.
But once he acted, he did it on eagle's wings. And to that, we can praise the Lord God, because when he does something, he does it with power, he does it with swiftness, and he does it with surety, just like eagle's wings.
Yeah, and we also know, again, that they did not do anything. It wasn't any type of a military action on their part. It was totally God that brought them out from the very beginning, at the start of the plagues, all the way through to the Red Sea, and now that they're out in the Sinai and bringing them up, everything has been totally dependent on God.
And so here, again, in this section, he's giving them advice on what they should do, not advice, commands, on what Israel should do before the mountain. And if we look there in verses 4, 5, and 6, he's saying there, if you will indeed obey my voice, then you shall be my own possessions.
Right.
And so, Steve, right here, we have a conditional statement. And you and I have made a big deal prior to this about the covenants that was made with Abraham. In fact, we did a whole 3-part series on covenants. Abraham, the covenant with Moses, and then the new covenant. But the Abrahamic covenant was a unilateral, unconditional covenant that God just promised some things. Well, right here, Exodus 19 and verse 5, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession. Right there, that's the conditional part of it. And he also repeats this if-then statement, or a very similar one, over at the end of Deuteronomy, chapter 30. And if you get a big picture of the timeline, right here in Exodus 19 is the beginning of the time of the law. And so right here is the very beginning. He gives this if-then statement. And then as time goes on, of course, they send in the spies and they disobey and they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And then the end of Deuteronomy is just before they go into the land at the end of the 40-year period. So those two if-then statements, the one here in Exodus 19 and the other one over in Deuteronomy 30, if you obey, you will be blessed. If you disobey, you'll be cursed. That's the message. And he bookends those conditional statements at the beginning and at the end of the 40-year wilderness march to make it absolutely sure, hey guys, if you obey, then you'll get my blessings. If you don't, better watch out. And so the Mosaic covenant is a conditional covenant. It's not like the Abrahamic covenant. The Mosaic covenant depends on obedience. And right here is where he states it. And so this is a major change in the whole system of administration with the nation of Israel.
And I want to make sure that we make it clarify that this covenant that's mentioned here in 5 is what you're just saying it's what's referred to as the Mosaic covenant. It's the giving of the law. This is not a covenant that he has made previously with Abraham or anyone else. This is the Mosaic covenant that we're going to see come about in the next chapters that are here. And so that's what you're getting at. This is a conditional covenant. The Abrahamic covenant was not. This is a conditional covenant that if they keep the laws and statutes that are given down and keep the covenant, that they'll be blessed. And then we also see the people kind of ratify it in the next verses when they say, oh yeah, everything that he says, God says we will do. Well, we've also seen them do that before in the past.
Right. So look specifically here at 5 and 6 about exactly what he's saying. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, that's the condition. If you'll obey me, the result, then you shall be my possession amongst all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And then in verse 6, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So what is he saying? He says, if you obey, then you're going to be my special treasure, is the footnote says there. That's some of the translations say. You're going to be my possession. You're going to be something that I can show off to the rest of the world. What he's saying here is, if you obey these laws that I'm giving you, then you're going to be this holy nation that will be an example to the rest of the world. You're going to be my possession. You're going to be my special treasure. What does he not say? What he doesn't say is he doesn't supersede the things he promised Abraham. Because the things he promised to Abraham were what, Steve?
The land, that you'll become a great nation, and that there'll be a seed that will come from you that will bless all the other nations.
Right. So the land and the seed that's going to bless, and in that term, great nation just means large, right? You're going to be a large nation. But so those things were unconditional, and God's going to do it regardless of obedience. Here, again, back to 5 and 6, if you will obey my voice and keep my commandments, you're going to be my special treasure amongst all the earth. You're going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What would a kingdom of priests be? Kingdom of priests would be very religious and focused on God, right?
Yeah, and they would be an intercessory between people and God. So they're kind of like an intercessory in regards to all the other nations. What God is also saying here is that the nation of Israel is being brought out of nothing. It's not derived of any other nations. It's something that God has put together and built together himself. He called Abraham out, and it's from Abraham's offspring that God has created this nation itself. And so that's what he's explaining. That's another thing that he's explaining here, in addition to what you're talking about, is that they're going to be his own possession, a special nation among all the other nations, that he will be their God, they will be his people.
And so right here is where it begins. And just to kind of reiterate, he's giving this conditional statement here, but it does not replace what he promised in the Abrahamic covenant, which was unconditional. What he's promising here is that if you obey, you're going to be this holy nation. The Abrahamic covenant, you'll have the land, and you're going to be large. You're going to be great.
Yeah, they're already up to upwards again of 2 million people at this point in time.
Right. But so here, now you can be holy, right, if you obey.
Set apart.
And so right here, right at this spot, right here at this conditional statement in Exodus 19, this is the beginning of the Mosaic dispensation, the dispensation of law. Prior to this, was Israel required to keep the law? Did God command them to keep the Mosaic law prior to Exodus 19?
No, there was no law prior to Exodus 19 or 20.
And so all the years from Abraham, even Adam, all the way up to here, the Mosaic law wasn't there, many centuries. Starting right here, this is the beginning of a new administration, or the biblical word is dispensation of law. And it goes here until the New Testament, when Jesus comes in and says, now there's a new one. Remember, in the upper room, he takes the elements and he says, this is the new covenant, the new dispensation in my blood. That is kind of the big picture of movements that's going on here. Kind of running out of time, so we're right at a cusp of explaining this major thing. So we'll probably hold it here. But just to remember from a big picture, right here in Exodus 19, when he introduces these conditional statements around the Mosaic law, this is the beginning of the dispensation of law, the administration of law. He doesn't ever ask the Gentiles to keep this law. He didn't ask Israel to keep it prior to Exodus 19 and 20. And so with this, we have a way of interpreting how major movements in the Bible work. Next time, Steve, we can get into talking more specifically about the advice here that or commands he's giving them on Mount Sinai. And we can also talk about how the law relates to salvation and whether or not the Jewish people were saved by keeping the law.
And I'm looking forward to that because there's a lot of intricacies there, a lot of things that's interesting going to be talking about.
Right. So this is how we reason through the Bible, and we'll be doing it next time, and we trust that you'll be back here with us as well.
Thank you so much for watching and listening, and may God bless you.